Intellectuals and Nation Building in the Post-Yugoslav Space, which was published last year. The book is covering 3 countries, which we are very familiar with: Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it focuses, as you will hear about, it focuses on particular case studies and events which were key to the process of nation building. We have 2 guests, Federico Giulio Sicurella and Dimitris Serafis. I will just tell a couple of words on our speakers. Federico Giulio Sicurella is a researcher, lecturer, and consultant in critical discourse studies. He holds an MA in democracy and human rights in Southeast Europe at from the University of Sarajevo and Bologna, and a PhD in linguistic from the Lancaster University. His research focuses on intellectual activity in post-socialist transitional societies, but also the discursive construction of national history and identity, and the media and public discourses on EU enlargement, democratization, and human rights. While Dimitris Serafis is a Swiss National Science Foundation postdoctoral research fellow. He's currently based at the University of Malta, and actually the background that we can see behind him is the library of the University of Malta. His research interests lie at the intersection of critical discourse studies and argumentation, with the current focus on media discourses, migration, and hate speech, as well as populist political discourse and rhetoric and communication in times of crisis. We'll get started with the presentation by Federico, and then we'll move on with the dialogue between Federico and Dimitris. And before starting, I just wanted to remind that for those interested in buying a copy of the book, we will circulate a flyer to order the book with a 30% discount in the chat box. So please, Federico, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I would like to thank you first for inviting me today. You've been very, very kind. I would like to thank our host organization, the Center for Advanced Studies, so Sanya and Lucia, whom I've just met, and Dimitris for accepting our invitation to be my discussant today. I'm very excited. This is the first time I present my book in public, and I'm also excited to see a couple of names and faces that I'm familiar with, very familiar with. Some colleagues from Lancaster University, from my PhD years, a former student of mine, colleagues and friends, and a few people I don't know, but I'm very glad are here today. So yes, Francesca said, she introduced me very, very well. I should add to that presentation that I spent very significant years of my life in the Western Balkans. I lived 5 years in Sarajevo, 2 years in Belgrade, and that was in between 2006 and 2012. But I've kept my interest alive. I've continued to work with issues that relate more or less to the Western Balkans. The book. This is the book. Let me show it to you. This is the book. It's based on my PhD thesis. And I would like to first tell you the story of this book and to tell you a few things about the reasons why I ended up writing this book. And I will tell you 2 defining moments or anecdotes that sort of led me to writing this book. The first one is a conversation that I had when I was 7 or 8 years old with my mom. She was driving and I was in the back seat, and I asked my mom, "Mom, what is an intellectual?" And she was taken aback by the question, and she said, "I'm not sure. I don't have a definition, but I would say that your father is one." And I would stop here. You know, I could analyze and overanalyze this conversation, but all I can tell you is that it was very important. I still remember it very clearly. The second defining moment happened many, many years later when I moved to Sarajevo and I started reading about, you know, the war, because that's what I was interested in. As many foreigners who come to Sarajevo, they want to hear and feel the experience of the war. It's very, you know, appealing in a way, morbidly appealing. It's irresistible, I would say, especially for a city like Sarajevo. So I was reading about the war, and I realized, I was 25 years old at the time. I realized that you know, people. I mean, the war started. Not okay. Let me tell you one sentence, and the sentence is the following: it started with the writers. This is the title of a chapter from a book written by Sabrina Ramé, who is an expert on the post-Yugoslav context. And the chapter is about the war between Croatia and Serbia. And the title of the chapter, let me repeat it again, is "It Started with the Writers." So when I read the title and the chapter, I realized, and I felt like a shiver down my spine, I realized, wait a second, so wars are not started only by politicians and are not only waged by armies. There is culture behind and around and in war. So this realization was very important to me. So I think it was in that moment that I realized, wait a second, intellectuals have a great power. If they can start wars, we should not underestimate them ever. You know, they can also do great, wonderful things for humanity, but they can also be dangerous. So with that in mind, I started researching and digging into this particular topic. So this book is basically an attempt to, you know, deal with this matter. My desire, which is sort of embodied in this book, is to unravel, to sort of examine and sort of disentangle the mystery, what I call the mystery of authoritative speech. So these are the intellectuals, they are authorities, but there is something problematic, I would say, about intellectual authority. And I will later on, if the hosts allow me, I would like to ask the audience what they think an intellectual is, because then we can discuss this. I will not now go into details. What I did in the book is I selected 3 case studies. So the first one is the Declaration of Independence of Kosovo and the impact that this declaration had on the Serbian public sphere. The second case study is about Croatia, and it's the entry of Croatia into the European Union in 2013. And the third case study is about Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it's the 2014 protests, anti-government protests, the so-called Bosnian Spring, if you remember that, the plenums. So I selected these 3 case studies. I collected a data set, so a sample of editorials, opinion pieces, interviews with intellectuals. We will discuss who these people are and whether we can actually call them intellectuals. But I collected all this material, all these texts, and I analyzed them in detail. The field where I sort of operate is called critical discourse analysis, which means analyzing language and discourse not per se. We are not interested in the technicalities of language. We are interested in how language represents and in turn shapes reality. So by looking at these texts, I tried to discover something about not only what these intellectuals represent and what they stand for, but also about the impact that their words can have on society. I analyzed a specific link, one of the many links, but this is, to me, this was the most interesting one, and it's the link between intellectuals and nation building. And perhaps later on I can elaborate more about this, but suffices to say that intellectuals and the nation stand in a very sort of tight relationship. It's a two-way link. And the idea here is that intellectuals are those who create and reproduce the nation, as many scholars in nationalism studies have taught us. So they are the priesthood of the nation. They are the leaders of high cultures and so on. So they create the nation, they reproduce the nation, but they are also enabled by the nation. So without the nation, the intellectuals wouldn't be there. Okay, and in this interesting sort of mutual relationship, something really interesting happens in terms of discourse, in terms of language, which is what I tried to extract through my analysis. And I drew very specific conclusions about the case studies, which I'm, of course, more than willing to share with you. But above all, what I think I achieved with this book is to, first of all, tackle the question, so who are the intellectuals and where does their power come from? And secondly, now that I've concluded this work, I feel empowered. I feel that I'm now able to engage with the intellectuals, whoever they are, opinion makers, analysts, experts, influencers, and so on. So now I feel I'm able to engage with them and to hold them to account, which is what we should never stop doing when it comes to the intellectuals, because they can be dangerous, as I said at the beginning. I can go on if you want. Shall I? Okay. No. Let me first ask, as I promised. Let me ask the audience, whoever feels like joining us. What is an intellectual? And I'm not fishing for scholarly definitions, but if you have one, that's fine. But who do you think of? Who do you picture when I say the intellectual? What does this person look like, or what is this person able to do, capable of doing? Anyone?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Tanya.
I'll refrain from trying to do an academic definition, but more of a sort of general popular discursive one. I think I usually think of sort of a man in between his 40s and 70s in a suit who writes to newspapers, let's say. And what else? Comments on everyday life. But maybe from your side, it also seems like it's people who are taken as representatives and experts as well.
Right. Can you give me a second? I just need to pick up something. Sorry, sir.
But we can play with this definition of a intellectual, it's disguised expert, influencer, and Tanya, you were referring to white middle class in his mid ages, important and so marked personality. Well, male, of course.
Yeah.
So that's but then when we go back to the French Revolution and Enlightenment period, those who created or made possible the creation of intellectual were actually distinguished aristocrats and female. They made a sort of a havoc for raising up intellectuals, sort of, kind of. So women were facilitators of those important and influenced intellectual personalities. We can always start from that tension of facilitating someone to play and to perform, and being one. So that's the and I'm also refraining from giving straight away direct answers and all that is like a commonplace nowadays.
Yeah, we often ignore the sort of reproductive labor of what it takes to create these
that's it
as well,
that's it. That's the background. So the background office is much more important, and the thing that I was not going back to Greece or whatever is the very fact that the moment when we started framing or structuring the educational process or the cultural constructive model of how one social person has been made, well, that's also part of this visible and invisible structure. Who made that possible? Who made the background for it? Either preceptors or gouvernantes, those who were there to make them go on and build up the structure of an intellectual. And I'm very happy to see many names behind these Zoom frames that I have here that I know, and I know that among you all there are a lot of people working on intellectuals from different disciplines and different points of view, and it's very nice to see now with Federico, and I noticed how patient and very careful he is in just positioning the intellectual part in all this. So it's very good to have this discussion. I presume now it's our intellectual who is having like homework problems in different aspects of.
I'm back. Sorry.
Great.
I have a cold and I had a bit of blood running from my nose, so I didn't want you to see blood on your screen. So So I will keep my camera off for a while.
Okay.
And then when I'm ready, I'll turn it on again. Sorry about this.
No problem. Just take care, and thank you for having us actually in this condition.
No problem. I'm sorry, I only heard Tanya's remarks, and I will start from there. Or maybe if so, Francesca, can you perhaps give me a little summary of what was said? Was it, or is it too difficult?
No, maybe Sanya can do it because she jumped in after Tanya.
No, I was, as French would say, j'ai causé entre-temps. I was just making a little conversation while you were away with some elements of who made the figure of intellectual even possible, and going back to the French Revolution, or even before, much before French Revolution, with Salon and women arranging those places where the public speech was possible at that time. So that was the my way of jumping in, because Tanya said, okay, it's a white, middle-aged, middle class, male, that is the most significant representative of the intellectual. And I just jump in to say that women facilitated these men to show up.
Right.
That was all. It's not related to the very subject you are dealing at the moment, but it was more into a gender.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that's very important. I will come back to this and also to Tanya's comment. I see Kevin raising his hand.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that I know you weren't looking for a scholarly definition, but my idea certainly is influenced by at least Gramsci's understanding, in that much like everyone knows how to make a few eggs but wouldn't be considered a chef, everyone is an intellectual in terms of being able to articulate a certain perspective on the world, but not everyone plays that role in society. And so in this case, I tend to think more, at least in the popular conception, of some kind of public figure who takes on the role of giving a particular worldview, and usually due to some kind of cultural capital that they have, they're in a position where they're able to argue this better than someone who just comes in off the street. And it's this kind of person that other people can point to say, well, I can't really explain this argument, but if this person were here, they could really explain it to you. So it kind of gives people this backing for a particular view of the world that they might share. So that's just my general idea.
That's very good, I would say. And you used a couple of words that I would like to pick up. And one is, okay, to articulate. So this idea of articulating a perspective on the world. You said something, okay, you mentioned Gramsci and Gramsci's notion of the organic intellectual versus the traditional one, which is something I also reviewed in my work. And I didn't quite catch the last point, but were you saying that people who are who struggle to articulate a certain view or a certain argument, they can rely on other people's way of doing that, and those other people are the intellectuals? Is that what you wanted to say?
Basically, this idea that when someone comes into conversation with someone else who challenges their worldview and is able to out-argue them, they don't simply shed off their previous perspectives because they've been beaten in an argument, but rather they kind of walk away thinking, well, this person argues better than I do, but if this other person were here, this intellectual, they could explain my position better than I could. And so they kind of have this role of providing some kind of basis for other people's worldviews who might not be able to argue them.
Thank you. Thank you. Now it's clear. Let me go back to Tanya, and let me tell you this: whenever I present my papers at conferences, whenever I can, I do a little experiment, and I ask the audience to picture an intellectual, the intellectual, to imagine, to visualize, and most of the time, and almost every time, people visualize a middle-aged man, white, with a beard or mustache, sitting in an armchair behind a desk with many books on the desk and behind, right? And perhaps smoking a cigar, or even better, a pipe. Now, when I do this, of course, I do this on purpose because I want to challenge that view, and not in a banal way though, because of course there is a gender angle to this, there is an age angle to this, and but what I'm interested in is the symbology sort of surrounding the intellectual, and particularly the fact that the intellectual, as we visualize him, right, is somehow detached from the world. Right? So there are a number of elements in this image that we conjured up that tell us a lot. First of all, so I'm using he for the reasons that I explained, right? But of course it can be a she. But he is sitting behind a desk. He is sitting in an armchair. So he is estranged from the world. He is, you could say, even, I mean, not only detached, but also above the mundane matters. So he has a better view, a better understanding of the world. Okay, and look at the books behind him. Now look at the books behind Dimitris, for example. Now those books tell me that he has read all of those books. Okay, so he has a lot of an amazing wealth of knowledge in his head that he can activate, that helps him understand reality better, to have a better view, a better insight of reality than ordinary people can, right? So these are the sort of the hallmarks of the intellectuals. But I want to challenge that, and I found a good ally in this challenge. And this is my main reference, scholarly reference in the book. And he's a Dutch moral philosopher, and his name is Dick Pels. Let me turn on my camera again. I think now I'm in presentable conditions. Okay, so my main reference is a Dutch philosopher, Dick Pels. Interestingly, he lives on a boat. And this is interesting to me because it sort of ties into his own definition of what an intellectual is. So according to him, an intellectual is somebody who is entrapped in an oscillation, okay, between two positions. The first position is the one we just described. So the intellectual is somebody who can claim a better view, that is a better understanding of society by virtue of their knowledge, their studies, their position. This is a word that Kevin used, position. So the intellectual has a position, and this position is one of sort of this God's view of reality. Remember are you familiar with the metaphor of the ivory tower, right? So the armchair intellectual looking above, onlooking, and analyzing the world. So this is the first position. But Pels says that this position is both a source of pride, because of course one feels proud to be in that position, right? So he calls it an epistemic pride, this sort of position, this vantage point from where you can see reality better than everybody else. But this position is also a source of anxiety, of resentment, these people are lonely in a sort of, not only in a psychological way, or also in an intellectual way. They are lonely because they're alone in that particular tower from where you can see reality so well. So what happens? It happens that the intellectuals come forward, and they sort of endorse certain social ideals or certain social causes or movements or even political parties and so on, because they have a need to sort of situate themselves, to sort of come down into society and to speak for society. And this is the second position. So the first one is estrangement, detachedness, and the second one is situatedness. And the key term here, and it's a big noun, it's a difficult, complex academic term, but I like it very much, is spokespersonship. So these intellectuals become spokespersons for society, for certain parts of society, for certain ideals, certain causes, and so on. But they are never in either position all the time. So they oscillate between the two positions. They are never put, or they never sit in one position. They continuously sort of oscillate between the two. And this is what makes somebody an intellectual. And I find this fascinating. And I find it very, very interesting, because it somehow, this theory to me sort of reconciles all the previous about the intellectual I'm familiar with, because I reviewed, of course, I started from Marx and Gramsci, or even the Enlightenment intellectuals. And then I went through Mannheim's idea of the intellectual as this free-floating individual. Then Bourdieu, for example, his idea of symbolic power. So the intellectuals are those who change reality by changing the representations of reality. And then Bauman, who spoke of the legislator intellectual as legislator versus the intellectual as interpreter, and many others. So, but to me, this idea of this oscillation is just wonderful, because it's a synthesis of what was said before, and it captures the dilemma, I would say. Let me show you something. I'll try to share my screen. Just a second. I want to show you the only figure that is included in my book. Okay, I found it. Let me share it. Okay, can you see it? Okay, so this is my analytical framework. Now, I think you can see the two positions that I was telling you about. The first one, so on the left, you see the intellectual as in this sort of detached position. So this is what we call the critical distance, right? So we are sort of away from reality, so we can see it better. And the object, the device that the intellectual in the first position is holding is a binocular. This is a good metaphor, right, for this better vision. So if you are in your armchair, if you read so many books, then you have binoculars to see reality more clearly than ordinary people. The second position, you see it's in the middle. Now the device is a megaphone. So the intellectual has sort of left the binoculars and picked up the megaphone. Now they are speaking for society, for certain parts of society, for certain movements, ideals, and so on. So, and you see the number, so 1, 2, and then there is number 3, which is what the intellectuals say about the groups that they are speaking for. So these are the 3 dimensions that I analyzed linguistically, because don't forget, let's not forget, I'm not a theorist. I'm not a philosopher, although I think I sound like one, but I'm not. I'm a linguist. So what I'm interested in, or what I was interested in when I wrote this book, is to examine each of these dimensions as they are manifested in language, linguistically, with concrete words, right, and sentences, and so on. So yeah, do you have any questions about this? Now, you see the 2 arrows. So this is the oscillation. Intellectuals go back and forth from these 2 positions. And what I try to do is to find evidence in the language of this oscillation. And somewhere I found it, and I will also show you some concrete examples. But it was really a struggle, because I remain convinced that this is the best idea or the best notion of intellectual that we have. But it was a challenge to find traces of this oscillation in the language, in the very words that these intellectuals wrote or uttered. Dimitris, what do you think? You are my discussant, and I really want you to sort of engage with me, to challenge me. I'm saying this because I know that you also thought a lot about intellectuals, and you have your own idea about who the contemporary intellectual might be. I can't hear you.
Dimitris, you have to unmute yourself.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So yes, I was about to say the thing that Federico actually told. So the fact that I was happy when Federico asked me to be his discussant was also because of a selfish reason, because I'm working actually on a book I'm trying to write with the same publishing house, and I'm actually reading and rereading Federico's book, and I must say that every time there is a different way of approaching the same pages, the same paragraphs, even the same lines in the book. And of course, thank you, Francesca, for the invitation. What I was about to say on the talking about intellectuals is indeed, as Federico said, a very strenuous thing to do, because yes, there is this kind of image of the intellectual that has this background with the books, can observe, be involved with the society and so on. But my idea, and that was actually how we met in the first place, was to challenge a bit the definition that Pels gives. I mean, there are 2 ways to, as I see, 2 ways to challenge this opinion. First of all, is how broad this definition can be. Using the same way words that you used before, and of course in a provocative way, Trump can be an intellectual, right? Figures, I mean right-wing populist figures that tend to dominate public debate in Balkans, in Western Europe, can be intellectuals. And the second thing, okay, that was a provocative comment, and there's also a constructive comment, and I mean, I really need your opinion on that, because this is actually the part I'm actually writing on the book. Is the intellectual always a person? For example, you examined editorials in newspapers written by persons. However, there are cases in which those persons, those intellectuals, are used by the medium, by the newspaper, by the website they're writing on, and so on and so forth, in order to sustain the overall position of the medium. So in this sense, by including these intellectuals' opinions, the medium becomes the actual intellectual who has the ability to do all these things that you, and rightly so, described in your talk before.
Thank you, Dimitris. This is what I was hoping to hear from you. This is amazing. This is a conversation. I think you can sense this. This is a conversation that Dimitris and I have been having for a while. And let me try to address both questions at the same time, like the proverbial, what is it, two birds with one stone. Because when I share that is Dick Pell's definition of intellectuals, at conferences and talks, I often get this question, provocative questions. He said, so Federico, tell me, by your definition, would Trump qualify as an intellectual? And I'm always a bit okay, that makes me nervous a bit, because in a way I should say yes, because these are people that can really speak for society. They do speak for large parts of society. So in that sense, they qualify as spokespersons, and we should treat them as such. And this is why I said at the beginning that intellectuals can be dangerous. I'm not trying to elevate the intellectual, to sort of idealize the intellectual, far from it. So yes, Trump could be an intellectual. However, there's something missing, because Trump is very firmly set in the second position. So the spokesperson. So he speaks for his constituencies, right? However, what is missing, I think, is the first position. So his claim to his epistemic pride, in a way, to quote Pels. So I didn't do research on Trump's language, but from what I hear, from what I heard or read, he very rarely claims, even implicitly, to have a better view, a better understanding of reality. He very rarely positions himself at a distance from reality. He's very much enmeshed in reality. He is on the street. Okay, he's not, we know, I mean, he's actually not on the street, but he presents himself as a man from the street, right? As one of us. He speaks like us and so on. So this is also the key to his success, right? So he is never in the armchair, metaphorically speaking. Linguistically speaking, he never holds a binocular. He never claims this better view. So in that sense, I'm hesitant to include him under the definition of intellectuals. Let me as a follow-up on that, another question that I'm often asked is, so what about contemporary intellectuals? Because okay, we can think of like good old time intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre, Umberto Eco, and all these, again, white middle-aged men sitting on an armchair. What about contemporary times? Who are the contemporary intellectuals? Are those, What about influencers? What about bloggers? What about storytellers? There's a lot of talk about storytelling nowadays. And my answer is always the same. Yes, of course, we should be ready at least. We shouldn't include them automatically under the definition, but we should be ready to look at them and think of them as new intellectuals. I mean, young people do regard them as guides, right? As spokespersons, precisely. They speak for us. They represent what we are and what we stand for and what we want and what we desire and what we fear. So these are the people that matter to us. This is what I guess young people think of influencers. So yes, let's be open here. Let's give them a chance. But of course, you can then stretch the definition in several directions, and you can think of because your idea is very intriguing, Dimitris. That the newspaper is the intellectual. The newspaper as the medium, the platform where various voices are included and put in dialogue, and that is so that eventually it is the newspaper itself that performs that function of being of speaking for the people. I can stretch that even further and say, what about social networks? Is Facebook the new intellectual? Is the algorithm the new intellectual? Because the algorithm defines and controls the conversation, the global conversation. What about that? Okay, so you see that can really be stretched. My proposal, if you want to hear that, my proposal to sort of begin to deal with this dilemma is it comes. I was very much inspired by an artificial intelligence scholar. His name is Jacob Foster, and he wrote a paper in 2015 called The Eye of the Swarm. So a swarm is just like a bunch of insects, right, of bees, and they move around, they swirl around, and that's a swarm. And the intellectual, according to Foster, is the eye of the swarm. And let me briefly elaborate on this idea, a very, very interesting idea. So basically, Foster argues, he begins by reminding us that we live we are immersed in a global conversation, right? Where we all talk to each other through Facebook and Twitter and other social networks and so on. And that constitutes a global conversation. Now, is this a harmonious conversation, or is it a noisy conversation? And according to him, the global conversation is more harmonious than it is noisy. So he thinks it's a polyphony, not a cacophony. It's a polyphony of voices with a lot of noise, yes, but he believes in the global conversation. He believes in the idea of the hive mind. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea. So collectively, thanks to technology and digital discourse, we behave, as a humanity, we behave as a big brain, right? So the hive mind, again, insects are coming into play. It's a nice metaphor. So we are all insects, but we move together as a big brain, as a big swarm. The problem, Foster tells us, is that the swarm can easily be distracted. And I think that's also a real thing in biology, that if you manage to sort of hijack one bee, then all the other bees will follow, right? And then we will basically destroy the swarm, or sort of drive it towards a trap, for example. The traps in contemporary times are manipulative discourses, biased discourses, false information, fake news, and so on. So we are surrounded by a lot of traps, and we need somebody, or a lot of somebodies, who can act as eyes of the big swarm. And that is a nice illustration of who the intellectual can be or should be nowadays. So somebody who can, you know, at least for a certain moment, at least within certain domains, act as a driver, as a guide for the collective mind, in order to prevent the swarm from sort of going astray, getting lost. And what I find beautiful about this definition is that it is an open position. So anybody among us can aspire to occupy, to take up that position, at least for a while, or at least within certain domains, right? So if you're an expert, if you have a cooking blog, then you are an intellectual in the cooking world. You are directing people's thinking and people's understanding of cooking and of other aspects of reality, of course. So to me, that's another good definition. But and I'm being perhaps overly optimistic here. I still think that we are not done with with our thinking about intellectuals, and I'm dying to show you some examples from my analysis. Can I do that?
I
Okay.
think so.
Thank you. Okay, let me start from a friend of mine, Asim Mujkic, whom I analyzed. He's a professor, he's a philosopher and professor of sociology at the University of Sarajevo, and also a friend of mine. And I analyzed one of his editorials. Okay, let me zoom that a bit. It's too much. Okay, so again, just to remind you, so this is the Bosnian and Herzegovinian case study. So the anti-government protests, 2014. This was a wave of mobilization, of social organizing against local governments, against corruption, against ethno-nationalist rhetoric. And what was very interesting and unique about that experience was the appearance of the so-called plenums. And these were sort of self-organized citizens' assemblies where people could practice some form of direct democracy. And then so these assemblies elaborated some certain demands, which were then submitted to the authorities, and most of them were accepted. So, it was a strange moment in the history of the country where people started speaking of a Bosnian Spring. Okay, then a couple of years later, no, actually it wasn't the same year. The political elections took place, and once again the nationalist parties won. So it was perhaps all for nothing, but I don't think it was all for nothing. And Asim Mujkic certainly doesn't think that it was all for nothing. This is the passage that I analyzed, one of the passages that I analyzed. So I am glad that nobody, starting with me, has usurped the public space. So no one of us has come forward trying to do something there, take action, or to simply dominate that space. Now, this excerpt is very interesting to me because, first of all, it resonates with Dick Pell's definition of an intellectual. The verb to usurp, so this idea of usurping, is very much central to Pell's notions of intellectuals. Why? Because Pell claims that whenever we speak for somebody, which is what intellectuals do as spokespersons, we inevitably silence those very people that we speak for, right? So we as intellectuals lend our voice to certain people. In doing that, we silence those very people. And so the danger of usurpation is always there. And Asim Mujic is very much aware of that. Look, I'm glad that nobody, starting with me, so he's very self-aware, has usurped the public space. The danger he's referring to is the danger of intellectuals basically appropriating these citizens' assemblies, because they speak more eloquently. They have all the big words, as Trump would say. They have the greatest words. So intellectuals could have easily usurped these assemblies, and so the public space, but they didn't. And Mujic is very happy about that. So no one of us has come forward trying to do something there, take action, or simply dominate that space. Now, linguistically, I will spare you the details of linguistic analysis, but I want to draw your attention to certain elements. For example, none of us. Now, by saying none of us, Mujic implicitly positions himself among those who could have usurped the public spaces. So he is basically implicitly self-defining, self-designating himself as an intellectual, as one of them, one of those who can do that. He is also, in terms of self-presentation, he appears to be a very self-aware, as I said, but also committed member of the academic community. I compared Mujic's interview with the interview of another prominent intellectual or professor, the late Zdravko Grebo, who was also very much active and vocal during the protests. And they have two different approaches. Zdravko Grebo is much more ironical in a way. He uses irony very much, whereas Asim Mujic is just more straightforward and open also about himself. This is one of the excerpts. I want to show you another one, again by Mujic. And here, I will read it out for you, but here you can see that, you can see this is a good example of a strategy that I identified, which is the strategy of the intellectual acting as a spokesperson for the national community, for society, but in terms of presenting himself as an emancipator of the community. An emancipator of the community. I am delighted that participants are given the chance to experience themselves as agents of change in a system that turns us into objects. He's talking about the plenums, so the citizens' assemblies. This is an opportunity for liberation and emancipation, which in my opinion has enormous potential. Perhaps all this may not end as we think it should, but I think it is very important as a first step to change our perceptions for our own sake and for the communities in which we live. People can finally say to themselves, look, I am being asked. Look, I can speak out. Look, my proposal has been adopted. And here, let me share my analysis, my analytical remarks with you. Here, I noticed a sort of a twist. Look at the first sentence. Here, I think what we find here is the typical intellectual vantage point. So this is the armchair position, the binocular. I'm delighted the participants are given a chance to experience themselves as agents of change in a system that turns us into objects. So you see this use of, the terminology, the language is very scholarly, very academic. So he comes across as a very knowledgeable person, and also as one who is, again, a bit detached from life, from what's happening on the ground. Okay. The second sentence is a sort of a transition. Okay, this is an opportunity for liberation and emancipation. Now you see he has dropped the binoculars. He has stood up from the armchair, and he is ready to sort of join society. So to come forward, to come down, to immerse himself into society, speaking for this potential for liberation and emancipation. And look what happens in the third sentence. I think it is very important as a first step to change our perceptions for our own sake and for the communities in which we live. Now here, what I see is a linguistic manifestation of this movement, of this coming down into society. First of all, it's no longer I, but is our. So it's we, right? To change our perception. So all of a sudden, he has become one of us. He has become a citizen, like a member of the community. And then you see to change our perceptions for our own sake, for the communities in which we live. The final sentence, I find it very interesting because I think it's a bit condescending. So he sort of slides back a bit into the armchair position, because he says people can finally say to themselves, look, I'm being asked. So he's basically, through indirect speech, actually fictitious direct speech, he's representing the voices of the people who are finally sort of so happy that they can speak out, that their voices are being heard. But he does that in a way that is a bit sort of, it shows a bit of superiority towards those people. So I think that in the final sentence, he is a bit back into the armchair position. Okay, this is just to show you how I addressed these texts, what I was looking for. So I was looking for linguistic traces of this sort of movement, this oscillation between the armchair, so the binocular, so to say, and the megaphone. So the two positions that define the intellectual, at least according to Pels. I have many more examples. Can let me share just one more. I don't want to abuse, sorry, yes.
May I ask a question?
Sure, yeah.
Maybe it will be useful. Can you elaborate more on the findings of the analysis, on the overall findings of the analysis? I mean, it would be useful to see how, paraphrasing the title, intellectuals speak for the nation in the relevant context.
Sure.
What are the main strategies? Not going into a detailed linguistic analysis, that would not be my point, but
sure, yes, with pleasure. I know that some of the fellows of the Center for Advanced Studies have an interest in linguistics and linguistic landscapes, and so this is why I thought it would be interesting to share these examples, and I have a few more if we have time later. But yes, I can elaborate on the general conclusions. I can share some general conclusions. Okay, so in the case of Serbia, so remember the case I analyzed is the impact or the sort of the repercussions of Kosovo's declaration of independence in 2008 onto Serbian public discourse. So I analyzed several editorials by intellectuals, and what I found is that first of all, Kosovo's independence had an enormous impact on public opinion, public discourse in Serbia, and it was experienced as a trauma, and not just a trauma, but the trauma. Like it was like just it was the last chapter in a series of traumatic events that go back to the Middle Ages, basically. I mean, you know, Kosovo, the cradle of Serbia, and the Kosovo myth. So all that mythology was reactivated, and that is perhaps no big surprise. What I found is that intellectuals, public intellectuals in Serbia, cast themselves as, okay, first of all, they framed this event as a dramatic crisis, and they formulated the need for national recovery. So society is sick, society has fallen ill, and we need to recover from this big blow. And intellectuals are there to help the nation recover from the blow. And so, I mean, this is just very short, very briefly, intellectuals presented themselves mostly as saviors of the nation, which not incidentally, is the title of a book by Dragovic Soso about intellectuals during the 80s. So there is a continuity, in the 80s when, Yugoslavia started to sort of crumble. Serbian intellectuals presented themselves as saviors of the nation. The same happened in 2008 with the Kosovo crisis. Now let's go to Croatia. So Croatia, the case study was the membership in the European Union. So 2013, 1st of July, I think was a big celebration. Sanja, Lucia, you were probably there. You probably remember very well. And interestingly, in the case of Croatia, what I noticed is that the intellectuals were very much focused on two aspects. The first one is, okay, now we are part of the European family, but what will we become? Will we be lost in the European sea? And this is an interesting metaphor that was used by one of my intellectuals. Will we be lost in the European sea? Will we be able to defend our national identity, our uniqueness? There's a lot of talk about what makes Croatian identity unique. I also have an example for that if you're interested. The second aspect is, okay, now we are in Europe. This is a great opportunity, the intellectuals are talking now, this is a great opportunity to finally break the ties with the old Yugoslavia, with the legacy of Yugoslavia. And I encountered a lot of passages, a lot of writing in which these intellectuals make it very clear that are familiar with this discourse, the return to Europe, right? After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the countries of the Eastern Bloc mostly framed this political, revolution in terms of a return to Europe. The same happened in Croatia in 2010. So we are going back to the place where we belong, finally, and this gives us an invaluable chance to finally get rid of the Yugoslav legacy, which in my text was represented also among in many ways, but I remember this idea of an octopus. So Yugoslavia was sort of an octopus with all its tentacles, clinging onto Croatia and on its identity, its politics. Now we finally broke free from that grip of the Yugoslav octopus. And finally, Bosnia. So in Bosnia, the picture is a bit more complex and more ambivalent. And if you remember the examples, let me unshare the screen because I don't want to. Okay. So if you remember the examples and Mujkic's text. Now here, what I noticed in Serbia is that most public intellectuals did what Mujkic did. So they sort of left the armchair position and joined the movement in the sense that they started acting as spokespersons for the social movement, for the protesters. They were really on the side of the protesters, which is a very intellectual thing to do if you follow Pels. However, and this is why I chose to show you Mujkic example. However, this movement was never full, was never complete. Yes, these intellectuals were on the side of the protesters. They articulated, elaborated a vision, an explanation, a theory of mobilization. They offered justifications for the movement. Yes, we should fight the ethno-nationalist paradigm. Yes, we should fight corruption. Yes, so they had all the big words ready for, and they gave them to the movement. So in that sense, they were engaged, socially engaged, engagé. However, just remember Mujkic, that move was never complete, because I noticed, linguistically speaking, I noticed that they never fully embraced the movement. They always had, I could always find a moment in the text where they were sort of holding back, right? Like, okay, yes, I am with you, I support you, but there was always a but. And that, to me, can be generalized, can be extended, that finding, and can be generalized into the following conclusion. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the intellectuals were siding with the protesters. However, they were more concerned, were more keen on strengthening their own position as intellectuals, like the armchair position. Yes, I speak for you, but in doing that, what I'm really after is I want to strengthen my position. I want my voice to be heard, not your voice. So in that sense, I think that to a certain extent, the intellectuals in Bosnia and Herzegovina usurped the public space, because they were never fully clear about where they actually stand. And I was glad, I mean, I was sorry to find out that, but I was glad that I could, sort of caught them in the act. Like, they were really sort of oscillating and playing with these positions. They were really in between, and I was, I think, I was able to detect that oscillation, that ambivalence in language.
I see that there are some questions. Are we going to go with the questions? I have maybe another comment, but Francesca, as you wish.
Okay, no, I think you can go with your comment, and then we can open the floor for the questions.
Okay, so Federico, my last comment on the findings was a bit on purpose. I mean, you present it as a profound analysis, a language-based, a language-oriented analysis of texts by employing previously in your discussion a definition informed by an interdisciplinary mosaic of approaches in public communication, political sciences, political theory, social sciences, and so on. And my last comment would be, what's the purpose? I mean, you told us that as I am, you belong in this plethora of approaches that create this kind of what we call critical discourse studies. And the question, when I teach, for example, when I have this discussion with my students or with people that I meet, they always ask me, what's critical discourse studies? Is this, for example, in social sciences, we typically talk in terms of disciplines, or at least disciplinary areas, in terms of frameworks, how critical discourse studies deals with that. And secondly, what's the interdisciplinary nature of critical discourse studies? An aspect, we have seen an aspect. So we employ a language-based analysis. So our analysis should be rigorous in order to prove how intellectuals speak for the nation, in your case. And previously to that, we employed definitions from a wide range of scientific and scholarly approach. But what's the purpose of this, the aim of this approach?
Right. Okay. So critical discourse studies. I think the spirit of critical discourse studies is to enable, to allow for rigorous analysis. As you said, it is a very important point, because so many people do content analysis, they call it textual analysis, but they're not really well versed in linguistics, and I think they should be, because that's a powerful tool. So if you have all these linguistic analytical tools in your hands, then you can really analyze text effectively. So rigorous analysis, but the spirit is, we do that because we are not happy with how things are, right? This is why it's called critical discourse, and not just discourse studies or discourse analysis. It's critical because the idea is that the critical discourse study is not just a method. It's often confused. There's a lot of confusion, but it's not a method. It's not even a discipline, because it's very much interdisciplinary in its it has a interdisciplinary vocation, and it cannot do without other disciplines. So it's very much branched, or there are ramifications. The best word for this, to describe critical discourse studies, I think you would agree, is agenda. It's an agenda. There are some problems, some social wrongs that should be addressed, that need to be addressed. And if you look at the literature in critical discourse studies, you will find certain recurrent topics. For example, discrimination. This is something we want to get rid of. So let's do it through language analysis. Racism, the migrant question. Now, this is very, very topical. And I know, Dimitris, that you are right, you're working on this. Also, anti-Semitism is also part of this agenda, environmental change, and of course, right-wing populism, the politics of fear, nationalism, and so on. So these are all phenomena that somehow can potentially, damage the public good and the good life. They are phenomena that require our engagement, our critical engagement. And this is what critical discourse analysis wants to do. And just a final point about this, critical discourse analysis is a tiny sort of, if you look at the academic world, we are a minority. We are a minority. And the way we try to overcome this, this situation of being a minority is by really engaging with all possible disciplines. I wrote a paper on the Balkan route and the language of walls along the Balkan route. And to write that paper and to do the analysis, I engaged with critical geography. I had no clue about critical geography, so I read a lot about that, and I borrowed a lot of concepts. And so critical discourse studies can really has this potential of establishing a dialogue with so many disciplines. At the same time, it can give so much to other disciplines. If you are a sociologist, a psychologist, a political scientist, an anthropologist, a historian, these are all tools that can really, really help you in your work. So this is just an invitation for you to not just read my book, that would be great, but just Google critical discourse studies, see what that is about, and you'll be surprised.
Okay, thank you, Federico, for guiding us through the intellectual trajectory which led you to come up with this research question and to write this book. And also thank you, Dimitris, and thank you to everyone who participated in the discussion. Now it's time for questions. How would you like to proceed, Federico? To answer question by question, or to take, for example, 2 questions together?
Yeah, 2 questions sounds good.
Okay, so we already have 2 questions. We can start with Eriola. Eriola, please, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Federico. Hello,
Ciao.
everybody. Ciao.
Ah,
It's so nice
ciao.
to see you after so many years.
Same.
I just wanted, because I had just one little thing, but listening to the entire discussion, many things came up. So I have my idea of an intellectual, starting from the mentioning of Trump. Well, he cannot be called an intellectual. Maybe he has some charismatic elements of a form of a leader who resisted so long in the public domain through a rhetoric. He used the rhetoric which normalized and legalized what was for many decades, for several decades, morally and legally seen as unacceptable. The intellectual is the person who raises questions, who doesn't give answer, or at least who doesn't try to give answers, but who raises questions, because the more you know, the less you know. And you should have the, I can find the word in English, the modesty to be able to understand that you don't know everything. So you cannot give answers. You don't take anything for granted, and you continue to raise questions and to invite whoever is listening to you to try to find something that is close to the answer. I was very much, I had some memories by the title that you mentioned, "The War is Started by Writers." It was like that, no? It was "A War is Started by Writers," or?
It started with the writers.
With the writers, yes. From my own perspective, like historical memory of my country, the intellectual is the worst enemy of the totalitarian regimes. And our prisons, our political prisons, were full of these people. And being the women or men, it was the same. So regarding what I saw on your presentation, from a gender perspective, the figures that you showed are visually men. And was that done on purpose, or is just a slip? I mean, because many gender stereotypes are reinforced by visual elements. And the visual elements is so unconscious that we don't even realize that we are pushing this, that the intellectual is actually a man. And do you have examples of women in your book, of women intellectuals that you have you're discussing or you are analyzing there?
Thank you, Ariola. Those were, I think, already 2 questions. Can I answer them? Okay, so the first.
Sorry, if I may jump in, we
Yes.
have a comment in the chat which is connected to Ariola's question, so maybe we can.
Yes, actually, I wanted to follow also the same line, so maybe it would be good to have, before you answer, to have everything about Trump, basically, because obviously that was the provocation for all of us. Sorry,
please,
if
yes.
you allow me. Okay, but basically I'm claiming the same what Tamara is writing here in the chat. For me, it was really problematic to name not only Trump, but also somebody who is like having its kitchen channel as intellectual. I mean, if we claim that all, let's name them, opinion leaders are intellectual, I think that that gives the term a lot of simply it loses its meaning in its original terms, and I think it's important to keep it. So I think it's very, very, very important that when you are discussing about representing a group, that you have in mind that there are different actors which are representing different groups. I mean, you also have civil society activists who are representing some group. Not to name politicians, that's quite obvious. They're trying to represent also some group. So, I mean, there are really different actors in social field, in society, which all claim that they are representing someone. And I don't think that you should focus on this representing side as much. And my recommendation would be basically that you maybe read a book. There is several pieces, article and a book from Stefan Collini, that's a British author who was writing about intellectuals, and I'm personally following his idea on intellectual, where he's trying a little bit not to focus so much on the personal issues and like Riola tried what intellectuals try to do, or what are their I don't know, characteristics as a person, but to try to situate them more on the, I'm a sociologist, so that's obvious, more on structural field in society, and what is their role basically in society, and who are them based on this role. So I think that limiting this only to the cultural and academic field would be very useful, and you did that basically in your book. You didn't take someone who is not intellectual according to such understandings. So just to make it more clear, maybe in these introductory words, when you're discussing who is intellectuals, I think it will be useful for you to read this book. I can send you, I have it. So I think it would give you additional value, because in this way, I really have an issue with understanding there is a difference between your analysis, linguistical analysis, which is perfectly what you are doing the best, and this introductory part, this theoretical part, which I think should be made more clear what you are considering, and just that.
Thank you, Gazelle.
Sorry, maybe since all these comments are interconnected, maybe we can just see if Tamara would like to build on this comment, and then I think you can answer all together. Tamara, would you like to?
I didn't want to, because I thought it was not a central point to the book, so I didn't want to interfere. But yes, I totally agree with Gazella's comment, and also I'm a political scientist, so I always think about where does the source of somebody's platform come from, and I think that's very difficult. That's very important in defining who an intellectual is. And speaking of politicians, it's a totally different kind of platform. And I think Gazella's right in that you should also ask yourself, who am I speaking for, and what is the source of the platform that I'm coming from? And I don't think in terms of politicians, it's quite accurate to say that they are public intellectuals.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all. And now, so Dimitris, thank you for mentioning Trump, because that opened the gate, like the Pandora's box. But no, I'm happy you did, because, and please don't quote me. I didn't say that Trump is an intellectual. This is not what you should take from my presentation. Please don't. What I tried to say is that, okay, what I'm not trying to do, what I didn't want to achieve in my research is to come up with a definition of the intellectual that allows us to say, oh yes, you are an intellectual. No, you are not an intellectual. So I'm not interested in a normative definition of who an intellectual is. I find it very problematic, because I think that that's a conservative approach, basically, because we are so affectionate, so fond of the good old intellectuals, these people who enlightened us, whose books we like to read and reread. But I think that society has changed, and we should also take issue with these changes, with the fact that potentially new intellectual figures have appeared on the stage that we should get familiar with, we should try and listen to and examine. Right, so this was my wish, my invitation to all of us, just to not to get stuck with the old-fashioned definition of intellectual. Just an invitation to broaden our horizons. Now, if I were to rewrite the book, I would add a new dimension, which I identify in your comments and questions, which is the performative dimension. I think this is a good, perhaps, way around the dilemma. Let's think of intellectuals as people, but not necessarily people. Can be also newspapers, other platforms, other forms of agency, who perform this as intellectuals. And to perform intellectually, if you ask me, means to always be caught in this oscillation between two positions who cannot be reconciled. And linguistic analysis can help us detect traces of this oscillation. If you find it, then yes, that thing counts as an intellectual. I think that in that sense, this is a useful category. If we think of intellectuals or of the intellectual as a performance of, a double position, then we can work with it. We can work with it. I wish I were a philosopher or a political scientist, and I wish I could give you a more elaborate, theoretically grounded definition. And I will certainly read Collini, right, Gazelle, right? I'm always eager to learn more about new models, new theories of intellectuals. Just to go back to Trump, and then Eriola also raised some interesting points. But Trump, okay. First of all, let me just briefly repeat what I said. What is missing from Trump is the first position. So this claim, this epistemic pride, this claim of being able to see reality from a detached, estranged position. That I don't see in his language, at least. I cannot read his mind, but in his language, I don't see that. But what I'm more interested in is the fact that he managed successfully to become a spokesperson for so many people, the ones who voted for him. Okay, we're talking about what was that, 70 million people, right? 70 million people. Now, I'm interested because following Pels, whenever somebody comes forward and picks up the megaphone and speaks for somebody, those somebodies are inevitably silenced, seduced, and reduced into silence. Those people made a choice. They decided that Trump's voice was going to become their voice. Yes, he's speaking for me now. Now, I'm interested in that moment, and I'm interested in finding evidence that sort of Trump was aware of this and how he used that position to linguistically, again, to perform his own persona, his own self. I don't know if that's clear. Probably not. Finally, 2 points raised by Eriola. I gather, okay, the Albanian experience, so the intellectual as dissident, very interesting as well. Let me reply with a question, because a typical recurrent definition of intellectual is intellectuals are those who speak truth to power, right? This is what perhaps, Eriola, you were thinking of. So these are the worst enemies of dictatorships because they speak truth to power. My question to myself and to all of you is, what about their power? What about their power, the power of intellectuals? Because nobody, no, I'm exaggerating, but this is what I'm interested in. Not so much the impact on, their ability to undermine regimes of truth, dictatorships, and so on. I'm interested in how they legitimize themselves by doing that. This is what I'm really after. And the gender figure, the gender dimension, yes, I would definitely change that. And yeah, this is what Eriola was speaking about. These are
they appear as typical, they have typically masculine features. That's very true, especially this one, and he also looks a bit old. That was not done on purpose. That was this is something I would change, perhaps. Actually, no, I'm willing to change to reflect the fact that you know, I want to avoid reproducing stereotypes about intellectuals. That's for sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Sorry, Ariala, please. I have interrupted you.
No, I just wanted to thank him.
Thank you, Ariana.
For your time.
Okay, I think we have two last questions by from Kevin and Tanya. So Kevin, please.
Hello. I've added some more books to give my work a little more gravitas. So yeah, this is extremely interesting. It reminds me, first off, of a quote I came across by Vuk Karadžić, and it was him talking about the heavy weight of an intellectual that he needs to tell. In this case, he needs to explain to all of these Serbs of Turkish and Roman faith that they are in fact Serbs when they actively disagree with that. So I actually had a question as a linguist, or rather linguistic anthropologist, with a background in nationalism studies, though I think anyone who studies language in this region is a nationalism studies scholar by default. But so there's a piece, I don't know how old it is, a couple decades at this point, by Michael Silverstein, the linguistic anthropologist, who wrote about, I think the piece was called Warfianism and the Linguistic Imagination of Nationality. And it's kind of his critique of Benedict Anderson, but it deals specifically with this we voicing that he identifies as a linguistic trope that's inhabitable. And yet someone can just and speak about we, and somehow people manage to accept that as not just a linguistic representation, but rather a kind of underlying reality to it. And I was wondering how you approach this we voicing and the I voicing that we just saw a little glimpse of in your analysis. How does that figure into your work here?
Okay, shall we take also Tanya's question?
Yep. I was sort of wondering more about the directionality of the discourse analysis that you're doing. So in terms of this, is it about how intellectuals reproduce certain forms of discourses, or in terms of like building the nation? So for example, the return to Europe and the sort of Kosovo myth and injury, or is it about how intellectuals, as you said, maybe reproduce themselves and a discourse, or how the discourse of an intellectual is reproduced, in which case the sort of male figure is, to me, seems unproblematic in your picture, because that is the discourse itself. So is the picture the discourse of the intellectual, or is it a representation of what you think the discourse is? Or is it about something else completely that maybe I'm missing in terms of this? And these case studies provide a different form of discursive analysis. So layers of discourse and the direction of these discourses is my question.
Right, thank you both. Tanya, are you trying to say that I'm an intellectual? Because I'm trying to represent discursively a discourse, the discourse of intellectuals. So I'm also by writing a book, I think I'm enmeshed in this interplay of layers of discourses. But I will come to your point. Kevin, the national we, yes, that very much. I mean, there's a lot of literature in critical discourse analysis on the use of pronouns in nationalist discourse, in populist discourse, and so on. And I will not bore you with sort of banal insights into that. I can recommend a book. Let me start from a book recommendation, Banal Nationalism. It's not a banal book. It's called Banal Nationalism by Michael Billig, one of my favorite authors. And he analyzes the use of everyday language and how everyday language reproduces the nation, basically. So everyday language as part of the nation building process, something we tend to forget. Now we think that it's all about, very important books, that are lay the foundations for a certain nation, or mythologies, or other cultural artifacts, or the school system, the educational system, and so on. It's also about everyday language, because whenever we say we, most of the times, we are thinking we, my nation, my fellow nationals. When I say we, I'm thinking Italians. And this is banal nationalism. So these are implicit, so unconscious even forms of reproducing the nation through language. Very, very interesting. And the national we, of course, was an element of my analysis, very much so. But you can't reduce nationalist discourses to the use of pronouns, because especially when it comes to people like the ones that I analyzed, who use language in very skilled and also cunning ways. They know how to play with language and with words. So whenever they say we can just presuppose that they are speaking for the national community. That requires deeper analysis. So yes, that's a good starting point, the national we, the use of pronouns, but it doesn't end there. There's a lot more. There's a lot more to it. But yes, I did analyze that in my work. And Tanya, the directionality of my research, what you said is a great sort of summary of what I did. So you asked me, so were you more interested in analyzing how certain discourses reproduce the nation, or how certain discourses, or how intellectuals actually try to reproduce themselves? And I think it's both, and it has to be both, because one of my sort of postulates, one of my fundamental assumptions, which I derive from previous studies, is that there is this two-way link between intellectual activity and nation building. It's sort of it's a constitutive link. It has been for centuries. It doesn't have to continue like that. Maybe things will change, but a good approximation for what's been going on until up to date is that the nation and the intellectual have lived in a sort of symbiosis, is that a word, where the intellectual, produces and reproduces the nation. Think of, imagined communities, high cultures, the invention of tradition. I'm quoting, very well-known titles from nationalism studies. So the intellectuals are the nation makers. They've always been the nation makers. So you see, this is one link. And then the other link is that the nation is the very structure that enables, or has enabled so far, intellectual activity. Because if you want to establish yourself as an intellectual, you better be part of what? A national academy, an institution, right? You better speak, you better first, use your language and your native language, and you better speak for the national community. That's your primary constituency, in a way. Of course, not all intellectuals have always spoken for the national community, but most of them have, and for a reason, which I hope I have explained. So yes, there is this risk, and inherent to this, there is this link, and inherent to this link is a risk. which is very interesting, and I hope it will resonate with your own thinking about intellectuals and nations. The double bind is, if you are an intellectual and you are critical of your nation, you're a traitor. So you are never at ease in the position of the nation maker, because if you are critical, which you should be as an intellectual, and you're critical of your own nation, then you will be, sort of what's the word for that? You will be called a traitor. On the other hand, if you are loyal to your nation, if you really speak for it, if you endorse your nation, you will automatically lose or abdicate your critical position. Because how can you be critical and be loyal to a nation? That doesn't go together, right? So this is a double bind. So intellectuals have led a hard life. I mean, and I feel for them. And when I present it in such a passionate way, Pell's theory, I think this is also something we need to keep into account. We need to bear in mind. It's not easy. Kevin spoke of the heavy weight. That's a different story, but it's heavy. It's not easy to be in that position, in those two positions, and oscillating between the two. You're always exposed. You're always at risk, because if you're in your armchair, people will tell, hey, come on, come down, join us, because you can't just be in your ivory tower forever. If you join society, if you become a spokesperson, then you lose implicitly, you lose your critical distance, because now you are compromised. Now you've sold yourself to a cause. And you've lost your epistemic privilege. You've lost your vantage point. You're no longer an intellectual. So it's a difficult business. It's a difficult business. And so let's also try to be, not to be kind to them, but because they don't deserve kindness. They deserve our constant attention. The intellectuals, I mean.
Thank you.
Okay, so before wrapping this session up, I would like to thank once again our speakers, but also all the participants to this section. And also I would like to thank the Center for Advanced Studies for hosting this session, and a particular thank to Sanja and Lucia for their support.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you all.
And also, okay, I would also like to thank every one of you. I was so happy to see and to even talk to some of my friends from the past. And vidimo se u Rijeci. I hope to be in Rijeka very soon. And please, if you want to purchase my book, there's a flyer which gives you a 30% discount. It's a very expensive book, and I'm very sorry about that, but that's a reality of academic publishing. But there's a flyer that's a 30% discount. That's something. And but if you can't afford the book, and if you really want to get a hold of it, drop me an email and we'll figure something out. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.